A lot of people struggle with just the basics of what's going on. Acidity, how do you respond to that? How do you respond to tannins? And the thing no one ever knows about is how it all fits together. People talk about balance all the time, but no one, certainly none of the public, really understand what balance is all about.
How do you define balance in wine?
I always think of it as two things. On the one side, you've got all the nice stuff, and on the other side, you've got all the nasty stuff, like a seesaw, yeah? And on the nice side, you've got body, you've got fruit, and you've got sugar. And on the nasty side, you've got tannins, acidity, and the burning effect of alcohol. And if you think of a seesaw, if one of them goes up or down, all the ones on their side go up and down, and the other side gets suppressed. Most people know acidity hides sugar, sugar hides acidity, but sugar also hides tannins, and it also hides the burning effect of alcohol. So if you had a higher level of sugar in your wine, you'd suppress all the nasty stuff, and vice versa. So it's just a very simple balance. But once you add food in there as well, it gets a little bit more complicated, but it's still the same ideas.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 35. In today's episode, we're chatting with Chris Scott, a UK-based sommelier who published the world's first ever wine podcast. I'll give you a full intro on Chris in a minute. I know you're going to love his brilliant tasting tips, including a couple of nifty ways to physically see or feel how acidic or tannic a wine is. Now, a quick note, Chris shares with us his favorite wine gadget near the end of the episode. I'll put a link to that in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/35 so you know where you can buy it, as well as the video version of this conversation so you can watch him demonstrate how to use it. Yep, that's another tease. You're going to have to stick around to find out what the darn thing is. I'd love your help to spread the word about this podcast. Please post a review on social media or even better, Apple Podcasts, formerly iTunes. If you do that, let me know and I'll give you a shout out on this podcast. Plus, if you do, I'll send you a free copy of my Ultimate Food and Wine Pairing Guide. It's a quick template covering the major food matches for red, white, rosé, and dessert wines. It's visually very appealing. It's stunning, actually, and I know you'll get lots of use from it. All you have to do is post a review on Apple Podcasts or on social media, then just email me, natalie@nataliemclean.com, and I'll send it to you. Now on with the show. Enjoy. My guest is an award-winning wine podcaster and presenter who runs a very popular wine tasting company called 3050, and we're going to find out what that means. He also produces a weekly wine podcast called the UK Wine Show. It's consistently ranked in the top 10 for Apple iTunes food and drink podcasts. Very popular, the first one, in fact, in the UK. He's born and bred in New Zealand, but Chris has spent time as a student working hands-on in the vineyards of Canterbury before graduating with first-class honors in engineering. In 2001, he moved to London, UK, and now holds the WSET Level 4 program, or diploma, I should say, in wine and spirits, which is the top qualification. He also now heads up a team of 20 wine experts across the UK. Between them, they produce or run more than 500 corporate events, wine courses, and private tastings every year. And he joins me now from his home in London, England. Welcome, Chris. Before we get to the wine, tell me first, you represented New Zealand this year at the International Triathlon Union's World Championships in Spain. Quite a side hobby you've got there. What events make up a triathlon and what got you interested in doing this? Have you been doing it for a while?
Yeah, so your classic triathlon is three sports: swim, bike, and run. I was doing the long course race, which is sort of almost an Ironman distance, not quite. So it was a 3 kilometer swim, 120K ride, and then a 30K run at the end. So quite a long race. It's good fun. And I do all sorts of distances, from sprints, which are quite short. They take about an hour to race, through to Ironman, which I'm not the fastest. That takes me about 13 hours. I've been doing it now for 4 or 5 years. About 2 years ago, I thought, do you know what? When I was younger, I represented New Zealand in rowing just as a junior. And I thought, do you know what? It'd be quite nice beginning in my sort of adulthood to do that at that end. And then getting on a wee bit now, as I get a bit older, I thought I might try and achieve a decent level in another sport. So yeah, it's a bit of fun. And listeners of my show know all about the trials and tribulations.
Of all the training, like how much training do you have to do to prepare for this? Is it hours every day or?
It depends on where you are. At the moment, I'm doing very low volume training because I'm going to the ITU World Sprint Champs in Switzerland in about 6 weeks' time. But it's a short race, so it's short but really intensive work. So I'm doing about 9 to 10 hours a week on that. And if you're doing an Ironman, you're up to about 15 to 18 hours a week in training, which is quite a bit.
Yeah, it is quite a bit.
It interferes with my wine drinking.
Yeah, no wine drinking. I was just going to say, you're doing all of this work. You're certainly burning off any calories from wine drinking, but let's get into wine then.
Okay.
3050. Tell me about how you came up with that name, what it means, where you were. Like, how did you come up with that?
What happened is my wife and I really wanted to start our own business. You know, we're a little bit entrepreneurial and we were quite keen to do that. So we'd sit on the balcony at home, drinking wine, talking about all these different business models you could look at. And we studied lots and lots of business models for about 2 years, I think we were doing it. We couldn't really decide what we wanted to do. There's too many options almost. So we went on holiday to Canada, strangely enough.
Huh. What part, by the way?
Well, we went to, what's the French area called?
Quebec?
Quebec, yeah, Quebec. My friend was getting married in Quebec. So we went there. And then after the wedding, we went down into Niagara Falls and we were drinking some wine in Niagara Falls, drinking some lovely ice wine, strange enough. And I had this moment of epiphany, if you can believe that, when you're drinking wine.
What a surprise.
And I thought, you know what? I need to get paid to drink wine. So that was it. That was the goal. That was it, right? That's our business, that we're going to go into the wine industry. Because the thing was, we were enthusiastic amateurs, didn't really know too much about wine, just knew we liked it. And we tended to go to wine regions just when you're on holiday. That's what we used to do. So we came back and we did some qualifications, did some WSET courses, level 2 and level 3. And we decided before we started the business that we would just do a little trip around France, because I'd never really been to any wine regions in France. I've been to New Zealand, Australia, Canada, but never anything in France. So we popped down and through Champagne, down to the Sancerre, went into the Loire Valley, and then we're heading back. And during that whole trip, we were just trying to work out, we'd done some courses, we knew something about wine, but not a lot. We're thinking, all right, okay, what are the business models? What's our strengths, weaknesses, all that sort of stuff. And the name came to us. We were brainstorming names, as you do, driving back from Sancerre, I think it was, and just writing down names and coming up with that. And 3050, the name, comes from the fact that one of the first things you do learn in the WSET level 2 course, I think it was that grapes grow between latitudes 30 and 50 degrees latitude, or most grapes grow between latitudes 30 and 50. And I've got this sort of view that if you understand the latitude, then you understand the climate. If you understand the climate, then you understand the grape varieties that can grow there.
Okay. So you're talking about the 2 latitudes, the 30th parallel and the 50th. Am I saying that right? Parallel?
Yeah.
So that's the grape growing latitudes around the world where grapes can grow for winemaking purposes.
Exactly. You can grow them in hotter climates for table grapes and things like that, but they're the main 2 latitudes. And if you understand the latitude, then you understand climate. And if you understand climate, you understand the grape varieties, and then you also understand the style of wine. It's sort of a way of saying, well, it's a way of covering all the wines really in one simple word, like 3050.
Right. Well, I thought it was a wine tasting club for people who are between ages 30 and 50. So well, that's fairly exclusive.
I used to tell people it was because I look 30, my wife looks 50.
Oh.
That was fine when we first started the business 16 years ago. It's a little bit close to the bone now.
Okay, moving on.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Now, you mentioned that you once hosted a wine tasting in a hot tub. Tell me about that.
Well, I didn't quite get in the tub myself, but as a business, what we do is we run wine tastings. And at the time when we came back, we set up wine tasting. And there were a couple of companies doing corporate events, obviously quite a bit doing high-end educational. And we thought, you know what, we really just want to teach people about wine and have some fun. And we thought, you know what, we're just going to go to people's homes. We'll get a team together and we'll go to people's homes and we'll run events at their homes. Some of our customers are corporates, privates, we do a lot of birthdays. It tends to be around events. And one of those events we do a lot of is hen parties.
Let's just clarify what a hen party is, just in case people don't know. You define it, Chris.
Okay, so just before you get married, the lady getting married will have a party to celebrate it with all her friends. And you get really wild ones and you get quite normal ones. And sometimes you get quite normal ones with a mother-in-law and things like that there. And then they go wild afterwards and all that. But quite often you've got a group who may not know each other very well and they're looking for a bonding activity that's quite fun and engaging. So we create tastings for that type of activity, really. So they do learn some good stuff, don't get me wrong, but it's really about them having fun. And we know that they need to bond together as a group because quite often we're hopefully the first drinks of the night or close to them. And it's a real good opportunity for people just to try different things. So I was doing a hen party tasting and they'd hired this house and it had a big old hot tub, which was like fabulous. They're doing tasting, then they're off doing things all the time. So they were really keen to utilize it. And I was like a little bit nervous because, I didn't bring my togs, didn't know about it. And I don't really want to do it in my tighty whities. I wasn't going to get it. And that's just not right.
Well, I thought maybe they were thinking you were the version of the men who pop out of the cake at bridal showers.
Yeah. Some of the hen parties we do work with a company called Butlers in the Buff, who do something along those lines.
Okay.
So it's good fun. We'd try to have a lot of fun with our clients. And they jumped in the tub and they were sitting there drinking the wines and all that. It was all quite, I wouldn't say wholesome, but not too bad. Something I could laugh about it with my wife at the end. The only downside was you don't really realize that, but sitting in a tub for a couple of hours is quite dehydrating. If you ever decide to do a wine tasting in a tub, make sure you drink lots of water as well.
That is an excellent tip for our viewers and listeners. It's the first of its kind, let me tell you, Chris. That's great. And so have you hosted any other wine tastings with unusual themes or locations since then?
We do lots of tastings all over the place. If you name it, I've done it. I've done it in a boat, I've done it in a tower, I've done it in a castle, I've done it everywhere, everything.
What was the one in the castle like?
It's just a big building, really, isn't it? They're all over the place, big grand dining tables, all that sort of stuff.
So no Outlander theme kind of with swords and...
No,
okay.
No, nothing like
Just
that.
curious. That's great. And you've picked up some tips along the way. One of them is how to describe tannins during a tasting, which I find also very challenging in terms of trying to explain that to my online course students. So how do you tell your tasters how to figure out what tannins are?
Sure. So tannins, they come from the grape skins, and a lot of people don't like tannins. You get some people don't notice them so much. Some people are very sensitive to tannins. But what I normally do is I'll get the guys to take a swig of red wine, swill it around the mouth, swallow it, take their tongue and rub it over the roof of their own mouth. And I have to be quite careful about that, the way I say it, because make sure you rub it over the roof of your own mouth. And the reason for that is I was at a tasting quite early on, or at a home tasting, and I'd said, right, what we want to do now is we want you to swill the wine around your mouth, swallow it, take your tongue, rub it over the roof of the mouth. And a couple decided they would swap tonsils in my tasting.
Well, that was thorough.
They thought it was hilarious. Ever since then, I've always said, make sure you rub it over the roof of your own mouth. It's one of those things, I think it really helps if you do that.
Yeah, it's a great idea. I've heard it described like tannins can sometimes be like velvet wallpaper or something textural, but that's a great way to get people feeling it for themselves with their own tongues.
Yeah, the first thing is make sure people know we're aware of them. And then there's if you want to go down that route, there's all those textural things you can describe tannins, silky gloves or whatever it is that people like to use. But a lot of people struggle with just the basics of what's going on, acidity, how do you respond to that? How do you respond to tannins? And the thing no one ever knows about is how it all fits together. People talk about balance all the time, but certainly none of the public really understand what balance is all about.
How do you define balance in wine?
I always think of it as two things. On the one side, you've got all the nice stuff, and on the other side, you've got all the nasty stuff, like a seesaw, yeah? And on the nice side, you've got body, you've got fruit, and you've got sugar. And on the nasty side, you've got tannins, acidity, and the burning effect of alcohol. And if you think of a seesaw, if one of them goes up or down, all the ones on their side go up and down, and the other side gets suppressed. Most people know acidity hides sugar, sugar hides acidity, but sugar also hides tannins, and it also hides the burning effect of alcohol. So if you had a higher level of sugar in your wine, you'd suppress all the nasty stuff, and vice versa. So it's just a very simple balance. But once you add food in there as well, it gets a little bit more complicated, but it's still the same ideas.
That's brilliant. I love that analogy, and I love that it's visual. You can really identify what's happening with balance, as opposed to it's still an abstract term. That's great, Chris.
It's one of those things that's really hard to explain to a lot of people. I spent weeks trying to find a really simple way of doing it. And I think just seesaw, those three things on each side, and it works just nicely. You can then understand things like let a wine breathe. What happens if you let a wine breathe? Well, tannins soften out. But if you soften your tannins out, you soften out the acidity, you bring up the fruit, you bring up the body of the wine, and the wine will taste just a little, maybe a little bit sweeter, maybe not, but you'll bring that up. And you can see how wine changes just by letting the tannin soften or the acidity soften.
Terrific. And how do you explain acidity to them? You mentioned that, so I'd love to get your take on acidity.
I'm a bit mean to my audience sometimes. So what I do is I get a really acidic wine, something that's really acidic. I get them to take a slug of the wine, swish it around the mouth, swallow it, take another slug of the wine, swish it around your mouth, swallow it. And then I just get them to lean forward with mouth open and see what happens. And within about 5 to 10 seconds, they just start dribbling like crazy all over themselves. And they will remember that. That's the key thing is whatever you give them, if you make it experiential as well, then they'll remember it. I don't want to teach people lots. I just want them to remember a couple of good things.
That's excellent. Wow. They definitely remember. And wine is a multisensory thing. So sure, there's tasting, but techniques like that really make it come alive. Some great tips here. All right, let's turn to your podcast because as I mentioned at the beginning, it's the first UK wine podcast.
First wine podcast in the world.
First wine podcast in the world. Oh my gosh.
For a long time, I thought Great Talk Radio had beaten us, but 9 months I went back and looked at their very first episode and I bet them by 6 months.
That is amazing. What gave you the idea? Back then, podcasts were virtually unknown. Where'd you get the idea?
My background in electrical engineering, so I've always been interested in technology and I kind of like learning. In fact, learning is my real buzz. People get passionate about all sorts of things. Don't get me wrong, I like wine, but I like learning. Learning about wine is brilliant. Do you know what I mean? So that's a really good one. So what I found was I was listening to some very early podcasts. Ray Kurtz's, he's a futurist.
Oh, yes. He also consults to Google as well, I think.
Yes, that's right. Before that, though, he used to do a lot of podcasts. And there was a podcast, I can't remember the name, but it was a very early one. And it was all about singularity and all sorts of weird and wonderful sciencey, science fiction-y type stuff, which I found really fascinating. But what I realized was that at that time, podcasting, you say, I do podcasts, and they're like, what's that? Now you talk to people and everybody knows what it is. But back then, for years, no one knew what it was. But I found that even in those early days, there was still lots of shows that could give you lots of information. And I like learning stuff. So what's the best way of learning stuff? Well, if you can have some headphones on your ears and you're doing the dishes or mowing the lawns and you're feeding your mind something interesting, then all of a sudden you can learn anything you want. And, I've learned a lot about triathlon recently. I learned a lot about wine early on. I stay out with a lot of news events from it. For me, to be able to see that people could learn from it and then think, well, no one was doing it in wine, or at this stage, I didn't know anybody was anyway. There wasn't. I thought, great, do you know what? I'm going to get into this. This is a great sort of opportunity here. And I did it. And this was before all the businesses there to help you do podcasting. So everything had to be invented almost. So we had to build RSS servers.
Oh, you had to do a lot of the software and programming. Fortunately, you were an electrical engineer. But it must have been difficult because there are so many easy services these days that make it easy to launch. I mean, I just launched mine in December, but thank goodness, because I'm no computer programmer. But like you, I had a background in high tech and was fascinated by the intersection of tech and wine and podcasts and wine. But yeah, carry on. So you had to create all your own tech and software to get out there. So what did you do at first? Was it solo podcast? Were you interviewing people?
So it's always been an interview. The idea was the show doesn't really have a particular length, although most of them are around half an hour. That seems to be about the right length for me. As I said, my buzz is learning. How can I get the people who know lots and lots about wine, trap them in a room and ask them any question I want? How do I do that? And I thought, podcasting, brilliant. Anytime I want to learn something about wine, I just go off, find the biggest experts I can on that topic and say, can I do a podcast with you? And I get to sit down with them for 2-3 hours, learn as much as I can. And it's fabulous. And then put it up for other people to learn if they want.
And so you're now on episode 598. Are you close to 600 episodes?
Yeah, 598 is this Friday, 2 or 3 more weeks. Yeah.
That is fantastic. Do you have any idea how many people listen to your podcast on a weekly basis or monthly basis?
Yeah, it varies. On a typical download over the period of its life, it'll get about 10,000 listens, which is not too bad.
Yeah, that's great.
That's pretty good. So yeah, some of them don't get quite as many as that. Some of them get a lot more, but around 10,000 is pretty typical. I'd say half my audience is in the US, strangely enough, even though I call it the UK wine show.
Right.
UK's number 2, and then all over the world, everywhere. So,
do you have many Canadians?
I didn't look, actually. I should have looked.
That's okay.
They're definitely there. They're in the sort of top 10.
Okay, I would expect that. Now, you had mentioned something about tiki bar videos. What was that all about? Oh, yes, and take a sip of wine.
I will. I'm thirsty.
This is by no means a dry conversation in any way, but cheers.
Cheers. I'm drinking a Montbazillac.
I've got Esk Valley from...
Hawke's Bay, is it?
Yes, it is.
Oh, lovely.
Cool climate shard.
Yeah. I've got a Montbazillac sweet wine because I've got so much wine open at the moment. I was like, we're going to drink, but I was having some custard creams, and Montbazillac goes quite well with custard creams.
Oh, lovely.
It's got nice botrytis notes to it, so it's sort of what I like, and it's nice and fresh. It's not too heavy.
Fantastic. All right, back to the tiki bar.
I mentioned that because the very first podcast I heard was actually a video podcast. It was the Tiki Bar, which was, I think, when, what's his name? The Apple guy found I've forgotten his name.
Steve Jobs?
Steve Jobs, yeah. When Steve Jobs was selling and podcasting into Apple, he got hold of this video clip about the Tiki Bar, and these guys were making it. He said, look, this is what we can do on our iPod. This is before the iPhone, obviously. And this is sort of what we can do. And I'd been watching a little bit of the Tiki Bar. And it wasn't really something I'm into. It's like 2 or 3 people, and they were drinking cocktails, getting absolutely slaughtered on TV. But it was quite hilarious to watch. This is before Apple even got into podcasting.
So early inspiration, but not quite your style.
Exactly.
Cool. Just to clarify, why did you decide to go the podcasting route versus a YouTube video show?
I wasn't actually sure why I did that. And I sort of had a look down, and I realized the reason was YouTube didn't really exist.
That would explain it.
YouTube was founded about 3 to 6 months before I started doing podcasting. So I don't think they were a force to be reckoned with. Certainly Google hadn't bought them by that stage, and they weren't really that huge. Podcasting was the first way of distributing content, if you like, over the internet, the RSS feed. So that was the way we went. And video, your audience can tell, and my wife tells me quite a bit that I've got a face for radio.
You guys are harsh on each other. Oh, dear. So why do you think wine is particularly suited to the podcast medium?
I don't know if wine's particularly suited to it, but I think a lot of things are suited to it, and wine is one of those things. For me, it's a good way you can get information across. Everybody listens to the radio when they're driving. You can't watch a video when you're driving. There's lots of jobs you can do. There's lots of things when you're walking around. You don't want to be glued to your phone watching a video because someone will nick it or walk into a lamppost or something like that. So there's a lot of opportunities to consume audio that are different to opportunities to consume video. So I think podcasting in general, it has those big windows, and then it just comes down to whatever people are interested in. And a lot of people are interested in wine, thank goodness. And as a result, there's a lot of people into podcasts for wine. And I think it's more to do with that. I remember listening to Oz Clarke.
The British writer, well-published, well-respected.
Yeah, and really great personality in terms of presenting. He fills a room, he's full of light and laughter, all that sort of stuff. I listened to him do a podcast on BBC Radio 4. Well, it was a radio interview, tasting wine on the radio. And I realized at that point that if Oz Clarke can't make that interesting, nobody can make that interesting. It's really hard to taste wine on the radio and make it interesting. I've done it from time to time, but I certainly don't make a habit of it, because if you're actually tasting the stuff, it's all about what you're smelling, what you're tasting, very sensory. Ears aren't normally part of that, except for maybe if you hear a champagne cork pop or something like that, but they're not really involved in it. So I didn't think tasting was the way to go. And that's why our format is more about interviews, a bit like yours, but we do a bit of news, and then we might do something technical or something that takes my interest, different monthly polls, all that sort of stuff.
I do think podcasting works well for wine, apart from tasting, because it's such an intimate medium. It's right there in your ears. We're so close to people's brains. We're like whispering in their ears. It so lends itself to storytelling and longer interviews. Like on Facebook, I think the average watch time for a video on Facebook is, I don't know, 30 seconds or a minute, same on YouTube. But with podcasts, the statistics show that people listen to anywhere from like 70, 80% to 100%. I mean, the finish rates are incredible because, as you said, people can be doing other things. It's very intimate. So I think from that perspective, if you're interviewing, telling stories about wine, educating, it all really works well on podcasts.
Yeah, I'm big into audiobooks as well. I love audiobooks. I listen to loads of audiobooks. I'm one of these people who can't find time to sit down and read. All my family think I'm weird. I just don't like sitting down and reading. I just want to be doing something the whole time. So audiobooks is my way of consuming high quality content, really.
I'm with you on that, Chris. I don't read physical print, even though I published 2 books. I do all audiobooks and just recorded the audiobook for Red, White, and Drunk all over. But I remember back in, I don't know, it must have been around 2000, I got a shortwave radio because I'd listened to the BBC at night when the transmissions were better across the Atlantic Ocean. It would blow in and out, and I would just listen to it to go to sleep. I was so glad when podcasts came along, even though I didn't have the notion to start one myself, but I jumped on that. And like you, I love audiobooks. I can go through lots of them. That's how I consume content as well. Let's talk about wine in the UK. You're right in the heart of it. So, what have been the biggest changes for the UK wine scene?
There's probably two completely different ends. You've got the local market, if you like, for wineries producing wines. They're really on a tear at the moment. They've worked out after years and years. So I think the UK wine scene, modern UK wine scene anyway, started in about 1950s. There was wine being produced in the UK in Roman times and all sorts of stuff, but about 1950s. And it was pretty awful stuff. I used to tell people England is one of the countries that still makes a lot of crap. And it was awful. When I first got into the trade, some of the early guys starting to do sparkling wines. So I've been in the trade for 16 years, and you had things like Nye Timber and Ridgeview had just started. So some of the earlier guys were just starting to make pretty decent sparkling wine. But most of the people were making these pretty awful wines. There were just some retired general or major had bought a vineyard, planted some vines, and next thing you know, he's trying to produce some wine, and it's horrible. A lot of it was horrible. But what's happened is once they realized that there was a product that was profitable, which is sparkling wines, because sparkling wines sell at quite a nice premium, and because UK is most of the vineyards around that 50 to 52 latitude, it's just outside the normal 30-50 bound. Because of that, it's hard for them to get any volume. So, volumes are always quite low, which means that, you need to charge a fair bit to make things profitable.
I've heard that Britain has some of the similar conditions to Champagne. The White Cliffs of Dover are limestone. Are there any similarities between Champagne and English style sparkling wine in terms of their conditions, their styles, that sort of thing?
Initially, everybody was going down the Champagne model. And the reason is, as you said, particularly just below London, there's the South Downs, and they're quite chalky. In fact, it's the same chalk that's in Champagne. I think the same chalk in parts of the Loire as well. So that whole chalk basin that's through Paris and Champagne is also the same chalk basin that goes through to the south of England. So it's the same chalk. Champagne, I think, is a little bit higher in altitude, and England's a little bit further north. And I think the climate in England's slightly more variable and slightly more cold as well. So the wines tend to have just a little bit more acidity than Champagne, but a lot of producers initially were just following the Champagne model. They bought the Champagne presses, they extracted the juice the same way, the same pressures, everything like that. And when you first started tasting them, they were selling at about £5 cheaper than decent Champagne, and they were pretty good. They're actually pretty competitive. And then over time, some pricings got a little bit more competitive, and you now compare a decent English Champagne will kill a entry-level Champagne every time, and there's the price. So from a value point of view, England's better value than entry-level Champagne is just pretty diabolical sometimes. Whereas the same price point, you'll get some pretty good English stuff. So they haven't quite mastered super premium yet, because some champagnes are just ridiculously expensive. And England, the price point seems to be about that £25 to £30 per price point. There's been loads of investment into the UK. Every year, the vineyards are growing by 10, 20% every year. It's just huge investment. Some of the guys are doing really nice stuff, really super, really nice, good stuff, actually, better than some champagnes. But it's not all about that chalk. People, we're talking about the chalk and champagne. One of my favorite sparkling wines from England is actually down in Cornwall, and they're on nothing like that. They're on a completely different soil. So the chalk is really good for England because the nice thing about chalk is it's got porosity and permeability. England's wet, so water tends to flow through chalk.
So what permeability?
Porosity and permeability.
Oh, okay. So good drainage.
But also it holds on to water because all those little shells. Chalk is just tiny sea creatures and it holds on to tiny amounts of water. So chalk's brilliant in dry conditions. It's also really good in wet conditions. The chalk's really good, but as long as they've got drainage and they're sort of south-facing, it's not too bad. You can get some good stuff. But what's been changing is more people are trying different styles of sparkling wines. It used to be Cival Blanc was the dominant traditional method of sparkling wine, and then everybody's now planting champagne method, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier.
I hope we can get some more English sparkling wines over here in Canada. Just we don't get them because probably the production is very small. You probably drink them all yourselves.
They're at the point now where export's a main driver. England drinks a lot of fizz. I think the only people who drink more fizz in England are probably the Germans. The English really go for it when it comes to fizz. It is now, there's three types of wine, white, red, and fizzy. And people will choose one of those equally almost. So the volume's been coming into the UK market, but now the volume coming on board is so much that they've got to export. And they're targeting places like America and Japan. And I'm sure everybody wants to get in with this sort of the monopolies over in Canada.
I'm sure they do. And speaking of export, how do you think Brexit is affecting or going to affect the wine industry, whether it's the British wine industry or European? What's happening there?
So Brexit, I was a Remainer. I'll just say that. What's happened with Brexit is the pound's got quite weak. That means that a lot of the wines imported into the UK got quite expensive 2-3 years ago because of that. And some countries' currencies didn't drop as much. So there's a few Eastern European countries whose currency sort of sank the same time as Britain. And what that's meant is the wines most people drink in 6 months' time are the countries who produce wine that their currency's just gone through the floorboards. Every now and then South African currency goes down through the gurgler, and all of a sudden 6 months later we're drinking South African wine like nobody's business. And what's happened in the UK is that European wines have got relatively expensive, and there's some Eastern European countries, their currencies have got weak as well. And as a result, what we're seeing in the UK anyway, a change in the mix. People are still buying French wines and Italian wines, because they're great wines, they're lovely stuff. But you are seeing, particularly at the bottom end, you're seeing a lot of sort of Eastern European wines coming into the country, which is, it's all good. I mean, it's all a nice bit of variety, isn't it?
Sure. And then apart from prices, are there any other impacts from Brexit on the wine business?
There's been some problems because every time they announce a date, we're leaving, everybody expects there to be carnage in terms of getting stuff in and out, and there's going to have supply problems. Because it's a change, there will be problems, and everybody's worried about supply and demand, meeting their customers. So what happens is everybody borrows a lot of money from the banks, buys a massive amount of stock and waits for it, and then nothing happens because they can't quite work out what they're doing. And next thing you know, you're having to eat into that stock to try and get it down to pay back your debt. So it's costing businesses, particularly in terms of stock and stock management. Warehouse storage at the moment, it's good luck. It's pretty tough.
And what about like seasonal workers? I mean, in the US, we have the issue with the wall because there are a lot of Mexican immigrants who work in California vineyards. But what about over there? Does Brexit impact the seasonal labor?
It does affect the wineries, definitely, because a lot of the seasonal workers who are doing either winter pruning, which I've done, and I don't recommend that to anybody if you ever want to do a job. Pick the grapes, don't prune the vines in winter. It's cold and horrible. But winter pruning and also things like, especially harvest and coming up in the run up to harvest where you need a lot of labor. What's happened is a lot of Europeans who would come into the country to fill those sort of working roles, and they come in gangs. They'd be from a particular country. There'd be a group of them that come in and they'll just work the vineyards over the course of the summer, so to speak. They're not as keen to come in anymore. Partly because the pound's dropped in value, that means that what they're earning is a lot less than what they used to. They're earning about a third less than what they used to for the same job. That's meant that there's a lot of pressure on producers. And it hasn't come to a crunch yet, but if it doesn't change soon, it's going to get pretty difficult soon for a lot of people.
Lots of different pressures there. Well, on to lighter topics. What is the best piece of wine advice you've ever received?
I don't know where I got it, but it was quite good. It was one of those things you just don't even think about. And then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, that's really handy. Now, I'm not sure about your audience. I can't comment on it. Some people, when they open a bottle of wine, they don't drink the whole wine that night. I don't know if you've met people like that. I've ran into them occasionally. If you live by yourself and you open a bottle of wine, you don't really want to drink that whole bottle that night. So what I would suggest people do is get themselves 2 half bottles of wine, ideally with screw cap. And when you crack open a bottle, just decant the bottle into one of them that's got a screw cap in it, screw it up, put it in your fridge or wherever, and that wine will keep just as well as if you hadn't opened it virtually.
Ah, that's great. Great idea.
And then you've got half bottle, it's in a screw cap. So the thing that makes wine go bad mainly is the oxygen. And the more wine you've got and the less oxygen you've got, the longer it's going to keep. And if you've got the wine in a smaller bottle anyway, and you're drinking from that, it'll keep better than if you kept it in the big bottle anyway. So 2 half bottles with screw caps, fabulous way of just managing your consumption so you don't waste wine, or at least you get to drink the wine in peak condition more often.
Absolutely. And it is a good way of moderating your consumption. At least you can see what you've guzzled down, to use one of your verbs. And now you've discovered, or you found, a gadget that's kind of related to saving your wine. Tell us about that.
I don't actually use it for saving wine, to be honest. This is a recorker. You just pop the cork in there, put that on the bottle, and then you just drive the cork in to the bottle. Now, I don't use it for recorking my wines because it's too much of a faff, to be honest. It does a really nice, satisfying sort of ka-chonk when the cork goes in it. But every now and then you go, try this. I don't know why it is. It's very satisfying.
That's great. Probably you, like me, don't have a lot of issues with unfinished wine, but
No. What I use it for, though, is in our tastings, we try and teach people some really good stuff. You talk about sensoriness and all that sort of stuff, but we like to have loads of fun. And sometimes we finish up with a round called Fastest Corkscrew in the West. And we get people up from each team and they get a couple of bottles or 3 bottles and they have to race each other opening bottles of wine as fast as they can. And when the first one finished, puts her arms up and yells, Macarena, because why not Macarena? That's brilliant the first time you do it, but you need to get the corks back in the bottle. Otherwise, it gets really expensive. We actually use water, so I use the recorker for that. That's why it's such a fabulous tool for me, is because, I mean, it's hilariously heaps of fun when you do this. If you do it as a competition, as a race, it's brilliant because you give people bonus points for doing them.
Oh, your classes sound like so much fun. I wish I could fly over and take one. They sound great, Chris.
We do serious stuff, don't get me wrong.
For sure. But that, I do believe you have to entertain to educate, because if you start with the education often and you lose people if you bore them, you have no hope of keeping them with you for a course. But Chris, this is just zipped by here. Tell us where we can catch you online, the different places where we can find you.
Okay, so the best place to find me is at ThirtyFifty.co.uk. That's our website. From there, you can get to the podcast. It's sort of got a big picture of me on the front. So it's pretty easy to find the podcast. You can get it on iTunes and all that sort of stuff. It's called the UK Wine Show. We've been going for quite a while. But mainly 3050.co.uk. I think we've got on Facebook on 3051. And we're quite busy on Twitter on 3051. THIRFTY, FIFTY, 3050 spelt out in letters, not numbers.
All right. Well, we'll find you in all those places, Chris. This has been marvelous. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. And I know my listeners and the viewers will really appreciate the tips and the insights that you've shared with us.
Fabulous.
All right. Take care. And I hope to chat again soon, Chris.
It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Thank you. Well, there you have it. Here are my takeaways from this terrific discussion with Chris. Number 1, I love the way he makes an abstract concept like balance in wine concrete and visual with his seesaw metaphor. 2, his test for determining the acidity in wine is so smart, though it's not something I suggest you do at a dinner party. 3, what you can do at a dinner party is use his more subtle test for the strength and firmness of tannins in your wine by rubbing your tongue along the roof of your mouth. 4, love his tip on half bottles for preserving wine. And 5, he had some really great insights into the similarities between champagne and English wines, especially the bubblies, as well as the implications of Brexit on the wine industry and on us as wine lovers. You'll find links to Chris's website, social media handles, podcast, the video version of this interview, and that gadget he recommended in the show notes at nataliemclain.com/35. Did you know that you can listen to this podcast on your smart speaker? Just say, "Hey Google," or for Amazon's Echo, her name begins with the letter A, but I won't say it now as it'll set off your device and mine. So I'll just call her Madam A, as in, Madam A, play the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'd love to chat with you about wine while you're walking the gerbil, cleaning your ductwork, or clipping your toenails. It's always wine time. What's your favorite tip or quote from this episode? Share that with me on Twitter or Facebook and tag me at Natalie McClain, or on Instagram, I'm at Natalie McClain Wine. If you like this episode, please tell a friend about it, especially one who'd be interested in those really nifty tasting tips that Chris shared with us. My podcast is easy to find, whether you search for it on Google by its name, Unreserved Wine Talk, or on my name. Finally, if you want to take your ability to pair wine and food to the next level, join me in a free online video class at nataliemclain.com/class. I can't wait to share more wine stories with you. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this one. I hope something great is in your glass this week. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclain.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.